Have you ever wondered why anti-trans sentiment has become so prominent in American culture and politics?
Or why 70% of Americans support same-sex marriage, while 65% of Americans still believe there are only two genders?
Or even how young Americans' attitudes on LGBTQ rights have been affected by living in a world where same-sex marriage has been legal for most of their lives?
At a time when public opinion on LGBTQ rights can be convoluted, nuanced, and downright confusing, we're here to make sense of attitudes on those rights in America today.
I'm Landon Schnabel. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Cornell University, where I focus on religion, gender, sexuality, public opinion, and social change.
I'm Chana Etengoff. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Adelphi University, where I research LGBTQ+ religious identities and well-being.
And I'm Joanna Wiest, an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Stony Brook University, and my work focuses on LGBTQ rights, health, and law and political economy.
We're all public fellows with PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute. And using data from PRRI, we intend to contextualize and help make sense of the current social and political landscape of LGBTQ rights.
Over the course of this podcast, you will hear from the three of us as we discuss our research on three different aspects of LGBTQ rights in America. Through our discussions, we hope to advance the fields of religion, culture, and public opinion on LGBTQ issues.
So first, you'll hear me in conversation with Dr. Kelsey Burke, a professor of sociology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who is currently writing a book titled Anti-Trans America for Pantheon. In our conversation, Kelsey and I discuss our joint research on anti-trans narratives and the rise of anti-trans sentiment in American culture and politics more broadly.
Following Joanna, I'll explore the divide in public opinion between support for sexual minorities and gender minorities, examining the role of religion as a strong predictor of attitudes toward both sexual and gender diversity, and how personal exposure to LGBTQ individuals correlates with greater acceptance.
Finally, you will hear from me and Tyler Lefevor, a 2021-2023 PRRI Fellow and current Associate Professor of Clinical and Counseling Psychology at Utah State University, as we explore the unique way that young Americans ages 18 to 29 view LGBTQ rights. Utilizing PRRI data, I analyze trends in young adults' attitudes towards same-sex marriage, non-discrimination protections, and religious-based service refusal, and the sociopolitical events that coincide with these trends, with a particular focus on the personal and sociopolitical dimensions of the developmental stage of emerging adulthood.
Now, let's get into it.
We hope you enjoy. Hi, I am Chana Etengoff, a PRRI 2025-2026 Fellow and Associate Professor of Psychology at Adelphi University. As a PRRI Fellow, I dive deep into their American Values Survey data from 2014 to 2024 for young Americans between the ages of 18 to 29. As a developmental psychologist, I have studied the 18 to 29-year-old age group for almost 2 decades, utilizing Jeffrey Arnett's Emerging Adulthood framework. Emerging adulthood is a developmental stage that often unfolds between the ages of 18 to 29, especially for those who live in industrialized countries that support higher education, such as America. Emerging adulthood is described as the age in between adolescence and adulthood, a time characterized by self-discovery, identity exploration, experimentation, individuation, and self-determination. From this perspective, our young American voters are likely to explore identity politics from both personal positions, such as emerging adulthood, and sociopolitical standpoints, such as the legalization of gay marriage in 2015, a big chunk of their life. Today, I would like to discuss how this plays out at the intersection of LGBTQ and religious rights by utilizing the treasure trove of PRRI American Values Survey data. At times, this data set included responses from more than 30,000 emerging adults, and we have data from this cohort for about the last decade, allowing us to really study how attitudes may shift over time among specific developmental groups, such as emerging adults. PRRI asked respondents to rate their levels of support for same-sex marriage, LGBTQ legal protections, and LGBT service refusals on a 4-point Likert scale, ranging from strongly favor at level 1 to strongly oppose at level 4. Of the 3 LGBTQ rights issues sampled by PRRI from 2014 to 2024, religious-based service refusals to LGB individuals has steadily garnered the greatest level of opposition from the 18 to 29-year-old cohort as compared to opposition to non-discrimination laws and opposition to same-sex marriage. I'm going to share with you a figure from PRRI that helps us understand this trend a little bit more. So what you see on my screen is a lovely interactive graph here from PRRI that focuses on young Americans' views on LGBTQ issues from 2014 to 2024. It represents the percent of young Americans who are opposing same-sex marriage in the blue, non-discrimination laws in the green, and preventing religiously based service refusals in the orange. What you could see is that across all of these 10 years, from 2014 to 2024, there has been the greatest amount of opposition to preventing religiously based service refusals. So at every point in the graph, the orange line is always higher than the other lines. What we could see is that even in years when we have a dip, like between 2019 and 2020, where the opposition for preventing religiously based service refusals went down from 33% to 29%, both of those rates were still markedly higher than the rates of opposition for same-sex marriage and for non-discrimination laws. So this is an important idea for us to follow up on in terms of what makes preventing religiously based service refusals a really unique issue for young Americans today. As a developmental psychologist, I consider that these findings may suggest that young Americans view the tension between LGBTQ rights and religious rights when it comes to service refusals as distinctive. It's possible that this suggests that this age group's freedom of expression values are distributed across both LGBTQ rights and religious freedom claims. Adding to the complexity of how we track this intersection of religious values and LGBTQ rights values, the 2024 data has just come in. And what we see is that 61% of white evangelical Protestants, 50% of Hispanic Protestants, and 63% of Republicans are in favor of religious-based service refusals. This is a hot rod issue. And I want to delve deeper on why we're seeing these trends, especially why we see peaks at different points of the chart and how that coincides with political movements and campaigns. Today, I'm joined by Tyler Lefevor, a 2021-2023 PRRI Fellow and current Associate Professor of Clinical and Counseling Psychology at Utah State University. Together, we will be discussing why religious-based service refusals are such a hot-button issue for young Americans today. Hey, Tyler, how you doing? Welcome back to PRRI.
Thanks, Anna. It's good to see you. It's good to be back. Love PRRI and what they do.
Yeah, you're a fellow from 2021 to 2023. Yeah. You had like the double header there.
Yeah, it was nice. I honestly didn't know a lot about them before I got the fellowship, and the 2 years really gave me a chance to get to know their data and did a couple of projects with them. And yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Excellent. So it's nice to have you back in the mix again so that you could see how the data has progressed since the last time you looked at it. So when you were reading over like the latest PRRI American Values Survey data, when we got that long scope of 10 years, but also in the recent data collection of just 2024, what were your first thoughts? What do you think about it?
So many thoughts. I had seen some of the data before, but I hadn't looked at them from the same lens that you're coming at them with emerging adults. So I also took that lens. But the highest level thought that I got was actually how consistent things have been. That I couldn't really find strong patterns, either up or down across the 10 years. But I was just really taken by like the vast majority, like, overwhelming support for LGBTQ rights among emerging adults. Like they used to that, but it's over 75% of people in most cases. And
Yeah.
that really stands on its own, just saying like most emerging adults are really supporting LGBTQ people's rights.
Here we really do get to talk about it in terms of we have this cohort. They're very value centric. And because I think this cohort is all about their values and individuation and freedom of expression, I think we are seeing this sort of steady pattern.
You use the word cohort, and it made me think of one of the thoughts I had is really about wondering how much of the effects are about cohorts versus ages. And I don't know if we could look at this where I say you'd have to follow the same people over time.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if these 20-something-year-olds, as they enter their 30s, are suddenly becoming less affirming. And so to maintain consistency, or if what's happening is these 20-something-year-olds are becoming 30-something-year-olds that are equally affirming. And so there is a larger like political shift over time that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a key question that I have also, right? Like when we look at the life phase of people who are really just self-focused, values-focused, figuring out their own stuff in their 20s, and not being burdened by questions like, what are the values I want to impart to my children? Or how safe do I feel with this book being taught at school, right? Like before they get there and they're in this sort of beautiful space of, hey, like you do you and I do me, and it doesn't really impact us, right?
Yeah.
Like, are those values going to hold as they age and as they become parents? And it's an interesting question. I like as a developmentalist, I tend to think the views will shift. I don't know about how radically they'll shift in all realms. I tend to think that they're going to shift on the realms where people see a value conflict, which is what like you're hinting at when we start looking at the religious service refusal data, because then it's two values. It's like my religious values and the value of being an authentic person, marrying whoever I want, and being able to be serviced for that marriage, right? And I think we start seeing these hints of like when there are value conflicts, where do people land? Even if they have been exposed to gay marriage being legalized for a decade, where do they land? And I think with parenting, and we see that now just exploding in terms of trans rates for treatment for minors, parents' rates to make decisions about their children's experiences there, the questions of books and which ones are going to be included in classrooms, right? All of those conversations, I think, are really a life stage conversation where suddenly people are confronted with this idea of, I used to think we could sort of bifurcate and you do you and I do me. And now I'm feeling it in like a personal space.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a developmental like task that people get to is their lives become more complex. And
yeah,
it makes me that like most of the people that were sampled were cisgender and heterosexual, because that's most of the people in the United States. And at the end of the day, if for someone who's cisgender, heterosexual, and religious, when they get a question about like value conflicts, they're like, well, this is a value I really hold, and I'm religious, I'm not queer. And so it's easier, I think, for a lot of people to lean back on that, to be like, well, religious-based service refusals might hurt me if I say we shouldn't do them, because maybe I feel something. And so it's like, well, I'm just going to pick the thing that's like helpful for my salient identity. And I've got a lot of empathy for people over here. This is the thing that helps me get ahead in the world. And so I'm going to lean on that direction.
Yeah. And I think that as you get older, your values have to become more condensed in some ways, because there are now more actors in the mix. There are more relationships in the mix. You have responsibilities to those relationships you didn't consider before. But it's an interesting question in terms of, when do you regain those values again in terms of inclusion? And when I did my qualitative work with and some were LDS with gay men from religious backgrounds, and then their one family ally, so they got to choose like the one person who was in their corner, and I found that oftentimes I was speaking to moms and sisters, which is a whole other conversation right there, But I found that the people who ended up being able to move the needle to be an ally, despite their conflict of values, were people who, like, at the core, were focused on what's healthiest for this person in terms of their well-being and their overall relationship with their child and not being willing to sacrifice it. And so at the end, it was really like a very human component to diffusing the tension. Like it wasn't living in the headspace of, academia or theoretical values. It was like a very human resolution. I love my kid. I love my brother. Enough said. And that was really it.
And it's easy to see how that like shows up in these bigger questions about like same-sex marriage or non-discrimination or service refusals, because it's so much easier to get back into same-sex marriage to be like, well, if I'm not gay or if I don't love people of the same sex, then it's fine. Like, it doesn't take anything away from me to love this. So it's easier to step back into that space you're talking about, though. Like, I just love people and I want them to have what's going to make them happy. Where I think the religiously based service refusals gets into a murkier space where it isn't always as clear cut. And I would feel really uncomfortable to be told that I need to do something that I'm uncomfortable with.
Yeah, and it's complex also because I think when people think of service refusals, even the word, I almost feel like it's a politicized word because service is a religious word, right? Act of service. I don't think that that's a coincidence in terms of how the issue has been framed and discussed and couched. Like, I think that it's almost a heuristic, right? It activates people to think about, when was the last time I was talking about service? I go to services. I do acts of service, right? It's a very religious valence to the whole discussion, when in reality, politically, legally, religious-based service refusals could be something as benign as, I don't want to cut your hair because I feel like it conflicts with my values of associating or beautifying people in a way that's not gender congruent, right? So like you go into a woman's hair salon and you're queer, are you able to get your hair cut? Is someone able to say you have to leave? And so I think almost the way that we have this public dialogue about the issue activates like these strong feelings where suddenly it becomes about, very concrete religious acts of service.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought about the languaging being similar, and because service is used all across a lot of religious spaces. One of the things I thought about with service refusals with queer folks is that it's a little bit harder for someone who's straight or cisgender to understand the damage that can be done by service refusals. The haircut example is so beautiful because it's easier to plug into. Like, what if I had a really hard time getting my hair cut? I think a lot of times people will say something like, well, you just go to a different hair salon. And that's like practically true. That is indeed what I would do if someone refused barbershop. But the more insidious part in this, and why I think this falls still under the umbrella of LGBTQ rights, is that is stressful for me to be told that. And it's not just your hair salon that told me that. It was also and it was also a doctor's office. And eventually I start walking around in the world like, is this world safe for me? And that actually is a burden that I have to carry that is pretty unfair and incongruent. Like, we don't see that on the flip side. People are being like, oh, you're religious. Do you go to church on Sunday? So therefore, I can't serve you this fast food.
Exactly. And I think that human beings are neurologically wired to be conforming, right? All the research says that when we step out of line, we feel really uncomfortable. And when someone shames you and says, you're not following groupthink here, you're not following our values here, no matter how full of pride an LGBTQ person is, neurologically, their shame response is going to be activated. They're going to feel like, I stepped out of line. I didn't conform.
Hannah, that reminds me of the piece that we wrote about the religious and spiritual stress and resilience model. Just like really try to tackle how religion helps and harms LGBTQ people. Because I think what we're kind of talking about right now are some of the ways that religion can harm LGBTQ people. That people can use religion as a way to like discriminate and to offer reasons why I should be able to be exclusionary toward people.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I loved about the thinking we did in that piece is that we really sat with, for an LGBTQ person, sometimes religion also helps. And they say, like, I really have this community of people who love me. And they get stuck in this really weird and tough tension where their faith tradition is both helping them and hurting them. And that can be so complicated for LGBTQ people to navigate from religion.
Yeah. I mean, I think the complexity of knowing that to lead something in its entirety would be more harmful than the harm you embody by wrestling.
Yeah.
That's hard because it's about harm reduction at that point. It's not as if there's one world where it's not challenging and it's not painful, like living within congruent values.
This reminds me of some research that Jonathan Haidt did and a few other people about like moral incongruities, because we're talking about kind of our innate moral schema for religious traditions. But we know this also happens when people are making moral judgments around religious things like the service refusals or same-sex marriage. And most often people actually have this innate emotional response first, and then they find logic to justify it.
Yeah.
Because like, ew, gross, like same-sex marriage. And then I say, this is why. And I think really full circling back to what you're talking about with emerging adults and value conflicts as they get older, I think that can happen where they, as they get older, they start to feel differently about the world. And then they lean on religious language to justify those like conflicting weird feelings they have.
Again, like that's the schema. And to modify schemas that are so ingrained in you is a really challenging act. And then the question is, are they motivated enough to integrate the two schemas, right? Like the schema of childhood and the schema of parenthood, along with that schema of emerging adulthood, where it was, there should be room, we should be inclusive, there should be an integration there. And like, that's why when I look at the data, I'm like, hoping, right? I'm hoping this inclusion lasts, but I'm skeptically hoping because that's really not, that's not what the data says down the line. But we'd really have to track these folks and have longitudinal work in order. And those would be the next steps that researchers really need to embark upon is, taking this generation that has been raised in a world where gay marriage has been legal for a decade, where there was an active DEI curriculum until it was removed, and seeing like what's the long-term trajectory in terms of how long-lasting are those values, and how does that play out across different groups, right? Because even within the PRRI data, you're able to see these differences between evangelical groups and other Christian groups. And I don't think they sampled LDS folks, but certainly you have an abundance of research on this, right? And so I think looking at both the group of people who have been raised on legalized gay marriage, and then also looking at the people who have also been raised on conservative values, and then seeing how they shift across their lifespan.
See that, yeah.
We got to. Well, thank you again, Tyler. It has been so wonderful to have this chat with you and this time. And we'll do this again, hopefully, another day, another time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Hop.
All right. Take care.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our segment today on trans rights in precarious times. I am Joanna Wiest, a political scientist and public fellow in LGBTQ rights at PRRI, and I'm joined today by Dr. Kelsey Burke. Dr. Burke is a professor of sociology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the editor of Contemporary Sociology, and an affiliated scholar with PRRI. They are an expert on the relationship between conservative Christianity and gender and sexuality in the United States, and the author of a forthcoming book for Pantheon on the origins and evolution of the anti-transgender movement in the U.S. So we're going to talk today about many different aspects of trans rights, and I want to begin by quickly going over some PRRI data on support for those rights, as well as LGBTQ rights more broadly to kind of contextualize everything for us today. So since the national elections last fall, we know that we've seen this flurry of political commentary on whether trans rights and other so-called woke policies and social justice kind of movements have gone too far. Such criticisms frequently target the civil rights of trans people, including their access to gender-affirming care, accurate passports and driver's licenses, and even bathrooms that match their gender identity. In the past year, we've seen some powerful opponents of trans rights appeal to populist tropes and messages to justify their positions. For example, we can think back to the Trump 2024 campaign message, Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you, sort of political advertisements. And in light of all this, it might actually be shocking to know that American support for LGBTQ civil rights, and that does include many rights of trans people too, actually remains quite high. So we know that a whopping 75% of Americans support policies that protect LGBTQ people from discrimination in realms including housing, unemployment, and public accommodation. And while that number has dipped a bit from about 80% in 2022, it still represents an increase from 2015 when PRRI started asking this question. And despite the fact that conservative lawmakers have begun to file bills attacking the legality of marriage equality, 2/3 of Americans today still support the outcome in the Supreme Court's 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges decision, and that was the decision that made marriage equality the law of the land. Beyond anti-discrimination and marriage, however, it is true that Americans have become at least slightly less receptive towards certain LGBTQ rights, especially those concerning access to things like trans healthcare. And each year since 2022, when PRRI began collecting data on attitudes toward gender-affirming care for minors, Americans have become slightly less opposed to legal bans on access to that care. The shift in Republicans' opposition to trans medicine bans that has gone from 35% to 30% is understandable, given that the GOP has been almost single-handedly responsible for all 27 such state laws that currently ban care, as well as the recent executive orders that have begun to chill many hospitals and clinics' willingness to provide that care across the country. And we know that some Democrats have also changed their mind, though, on these bans, and they've moved about from 75% to 70% opposition. So, with that all in mind, we can begin our conversation here by trying to explain some of that slipping support. And so I'm curious, what is your reaction to some of these figures, Dr. Burke?
Well, thanks for inviting me to have this conversation. One of the things I love about PRRI is that we get numbers to give us sort of the broad context of what's happening in the country. As a sociologist, I'm primarily a qualitative researcher, so I do my work on the ground, talking to people, listening to people to add some depth to some of the quantitative data that PRRI offers. So I have been observing these debates as they unfold in my home state of Nebraska. We passed a law that banned gender-affirming healthcare for minors in 2023. It's not a complete ban, but almost a total ban. You may remember that our state made national news because a progressive senator in the state, Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, decided to try to filibuster that bill when it came forth and had a record-breaking filibuster that really shut everything down in the legislature. We weren't able to pass other bills. Senators were really at a standstill over how to move forward. Ultimately, the law did pass with the exact number of senators that it was required to get. And so I watched as there was this political rhetoric unfolding about the necessity of this bill to protect kids, right? That's the language, that we need to protect children from medical procedures that are characterized as experimental, as permanent, that young people might later regret. That rhetoric is just not what matches the stories that people are telling on the ground. So there were, trans people, trans kids, their family members who were at the legislature every day when debates were taking place, who were meeting with senators and who were telling them their stories, who were painting a picture that looked very different than like the political ads that you referenced, to say that these are decisions that are often, very hard decisions for families to make, but that they make them as individuals in consultation with their doctors, not jumping into any sort of procedures that would be more permanent or that would involve medication. And what was interesting to observe as a sociologist is just how those very personal stories seem to fall upon deaf ears as conservative senators relied on the political talking points that often came from out of the state. So the Nebraska bill, it's called the Let Them Grow Act, had some things that were particular to the state of Nebraska that are unlike some of these similar bills that have passed, but in many ways is sort of word for word identical to bills that, what's the number now, 27 states have some sort of gender affirming care ban, and those often come from not senators within those states themselves, but national political organizations that have a conservative Christian religious affiliation, that have a very clear political and religious agenda that's very different than the kind of rhetoric about protecting kids from medical harm. So that's some of the on the ground stuff that I've seen to contextualize these data.
I think that's so important for many reasons. I mean, one, you kind of note that the legislation for these bills, not just in Nebraska, but across many, over 24 states now, appear to be kind of drawing from just a couple of conservative think tanks, sort of mock-ups of what they think these state lawmakers should be kind of creating law out of in states like Nebraska. Is that kind of what we see on the ground there?
Yeah, and one of the things that was interesting in our state, we simultaneously had an abortion ban bill that was trying to get through, and it wasn't successful. And in the very final days of the floor debate for the gender affirming care ban bill, a senator proposed an amendment that tacked on an abortion ban to that bill, said all of these things can be considered under this category, let them grow, that we're protecting unborn life along with trans kids. And so that abortion ban passed as an amendment for the gender affirming care ban bill. I bring that up to say that I think these issues are interrelated, and that when it comes to the conservative movement more broadly, that these attacks on reproductive rights, on LGBTQ rights, these are proposed by the same kind of political actors, often the same kind of political think tanks that are behind legislation. And so we have to see these as all part of the same story.
I totally agree. I mean, it's interesting that you bring up what's going on with the sort of convergence of anti-trans legislation and anti-abortion legislation, and even becoming kind of the same legislation in a place like Nebraska. And I think about that because we see all these kinds of fringe medical organizations also pop up to sort of provide some sort of veneer of legitimacy to these campaigns. And you see this sort of, some of these are the same think tanks attacking both trans rights to healthcare access and abortion rights. And they use the same sort of logic, like regret. Regret is something that was very kind of powerfully used in attempts to ban and successful bans on things called partial birth abortion a decade or two ago. And of course, partial birth abortion itself is not a medical term. It was one kind of concocted by these sort of conservative think tanks to push something that sounds like something that many Americans are interested in banning, but they might not be if they weren't kind of being delivered, these messages, by fringe groups that kind of test certain ways of framing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the professionalization that goes into these kind of credentialing, it's interesting that it's contradictory as it plays out in legislative debates, because the fact that we have every major medical association in the country defending gender affirming care and coming out in opposition of these kinds of laws, conservatives have used that broad consensus to paint the entire medical establishment as a kind of conspiracy. And we're seeing this play out at the federal level when it comes to the, Make America Healthy Again movement, when it comes to who's in charge of our Department of Health and Human Services. So all of these things, I think, are interconnected.
Yes, it really seems like they are. The Make America Healthy Again kind of link into this broader anti-trans movement is fascinating and really horrifying. I think, for instance, about reports that we get out of HHS last, I guess it was May, on pediatric gender-affirming care and kind of using the same sort of logic that we see RFK Jr. and others fight vaccinations with as well. And so I think you see the sort of same arguments. Some of the same actors are really interested in going after, as what you note, are potentially life-saving, evidence-based kind of treatments that the American Medical Association and others like it are promoting. Okay, let's talk about the Zoomers. I often hear this sort of Pollyannish sentiment about how the kids will save us, and other sort of hopeful statements about how each new generation kind of leads us toward a more progressive future, at least in terms of kind of social issues. But some recent PRRI data seem to contradict that story, at least when it comes to trans rights. So, for instance, some new data show us that only 33% of American men, and we can assume those are vast majority are cis men, ages 18 to 29, believe that such medical care should be available to minors. And that's a level of support that looks more like men in the 50-plus range rather than the attitudes of millennial counterparts, which are somewhere around 8 points higher in terms of support. And so this declining support, as you noted just a second ago, it's all despite the fact that major domestic and international medical groups like the American Medical Association, like the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, have all repeatedly for years denounced these sorts of bans on gender-affirming care. And so I know that you've written this important piece for The Hill last year on Generation Z's conservative attitudes more broadly. As I'm wondering what you make of these trends in declining support for gender-affirming care and any other kind of thing that you've noticed in Generation Z and maybe men in particular.
I wrote that piece in The Hill because as a sociology professor, I teach in this discipline that is, considered to be, the wokest of the woke, or among those that are promoting this so-called liberal indoctrination of college students. Sociology has been banned in the state of Florida from its gen ed curriculum for that reason. And that really doesn't match my lived experience as a college professor in a red state, where my students are certainly politically diverse, not uniformly progressive. Many are very conservative. And when it comes to institutional policies and procedures, I also don't believe that those are, typifying any progressive values. So that was sort of the heart of the piece. And yeah, I think it's quite interesting that Gen Z, there are certain measures that suggest that this is a generation that is more progressive. We've, seen this trend that younger generations are more progressive than their older counterparts for decades now, but that's not necessarily true when it comes to LGBTQ issues. And I think we have to, just like thinking about how state legislation is connected to a broader national enterprise, I think that's also true for the reality of young people in the United States, whether it's on college campuses or outside of that there is a huge right-wing media ecosystem that is really focusing on getting its messages to young people, whether it's through campus groups or organizations like Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA, or on social media and efforts to get messaging from what is often called the manosphere out, that has very staunch anti-trans sentiment. that all of this is reaching young people. And I don't think that there's really an effective counter movement. Those of us who are teaching sociology or political science or women's and gender studies, I think part of our job is to try to teach young people how to learn, how to read critically, how to take in information. But there isn't the same kind of network or financial backing into progressive messaging in the same way that at the right wing, there's like various levels of medias that are pushing these messages and that clearly young people are hearing. I think it's incredible that young men specifically are so taken by these messages that their levels of support for trans people is so low.
It's so important what you mentioned about how much of a networked sort of influence this is in terms of the sort of media outlets that Generation Z is encountering, as well as the sort of campus political groups. I'm wondering, do you have any idea about what makes this generation so amenable to that message? Is it that you're just being kind of hit with it over and over and over again? Is there something about their sort of declining standards of living and the sort of populist message that comes with some of this sort of anti-trans and anti-woke, anti-DEI kind of movement politics? Just curious, why do they seem so receptive?
It's a good question. I mean, plenty of people have theorized that the anti-trans movement is not about trans people, that gender is a scapegoat. Judith Butler talks about it as a specter that fills in for what are the actual real concerns that we should be confronting, whether that's our lack of economic stability, whether it's climate change, et cetera. So certainly young people perhaps might be filling in some of their other anxieties with a focus on gender or transgender related issues. But I think more than how are young people being receptive to these messages, it's how these messages are taking on so many different dimensions that are so compelling. So Turning Point USA, as an example, has offered funds so that social media influencers can take up their messages, but they appear just to be like, really good looking, fun, successful young people who are on social media sites. They're not on any legacy news outlet. They talk about things other than politics. They talk about lifestyle or movies, television. So they make their messages really compelling. And so I think maybe it's less of what's unique about Gen Z, but really what's unique about these messages that are pulling young people in.
That is absolutely fascinating. I had no idea how kind of down to like what is the individual TikTok that someone is seeing, how just kind of like targeted and how kind of thought through that material is. That is fascinating. And we see that there's an international trend to this too. I've been kind of obsessed lately with looking at the gender gap in other kind of elections. In Germany, for instance, a few months ago, Gen Z voters really split on gender lines. So you saw that those identified women in Gen Z in Germany went for Die Linke, which is the more kind of progressive left kind of party in the parliament. And then overwhelming the top pick for Generation Z men in Germany was AfD, which is the anti-immigrant far-right party that was seen as so far-right that there have been discussions over the last several years about whether they should be banned entirely from being an actual political party that can take seats in government in Germany. So it does seem like that there's some broader sort of political trend, as you're noting, like that it is not just something kind of inherent to these young men and voters, but rather that there are really kind of coordinated political efforts here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think we're with the most recent presidential election and more, that it's important for us to think less about America as exceptional and to make these connections to what's happening in other places. So I'm glad that you brought up the case of Germany to say that we can see similar trends or similar patterns taking place there.
Extremely. All right, I have one final question for us to discuss, and it has a lot to do with your forthcoming book on the anti-trans movement. And so what I really want to know is what we miss when we talk about attacks on trans rights today as one part of a larger culture war, and that's in scare quotes, a culture war, and what might be a better way of thinking about these trends.
Well, thanks for the plug for my forthcoming work. I mean, I think some of this framing has really been influenced by your own work and conversations with you through PRRI. This idea of a culture war makes it sound like these divisions or these polarizations are those that have always been there and that always will remain, that we are just on these sort of opposite or unchanging sides based on our beliefs, based on our religions, based on who we are. And I think that this framing really leaves out any history or social context of like what has created the conditions for these debates to unfold. So I like to think about, a culture war or polarization is really not the cause of our division, but it's like an effect of our political system. And so my work is trying to trace this history and broader social context. And I think some of the things we learned, for example, is that it's not just conservatives that are implicated when it comes to anti-trans rhetoric or policies. So when it comes to the history of trans medicine, for example, there are progressive or liberal ideas that have had, unintended or illiberal consequences. And I think that by just framing gender-affirming healthcare or transgender rights as, us versus them, the right versus the left, that leaves out some of that nuance, and that's really important to get the full story.
Yeah, 100%. It's as you note, it's important for us to not think about this as an organic trend. And I know you're definitely right that we've been talking a lot about the organized right today. But if you go to any article about trans medicine on the New York Times and you go to the comments section, which is ill-advised, but if you go to the comments section, you can see all of the top comments that have been kind of recommended by other readers are very skeptical of trans healthcare. And we know from data that they're not necessarily a majority in terms of more kind of liberal, progressive-leaning readers of the New York Times and voters. But it does seem that there's this kind of this organized movement has had a real effect, much broader than just kind of people who are already kind of susceptible to sort of anti-trans sentiment.
Absolutely. And I think that that's intentional, that the organized right is able to take on individuals who might call themselves progressives or secular activists rather than religious, call themselves feminists, and they're able to co-opt those messages as part of their broader cause. But that we should treat that skeptically, just as we treat skeptically perhaps our own assumptions that this culture war framing is the best way to understand our differences.
100%. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much again, Dr. Burke, for joining us today and providing these really important insights on the nature of this growing anti-trans rights movement.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Landon Schnabel, a sociologist at Cornell University and a public fellow at the Public Religion Research Institute. Today, I want to share some findings from PRRI's 2023 Gender and Politics Survey that initially surprised me and might surprise you too. Here's the puzzle. A little over 2/3 of Americans now support same-sex marriage. At the same time, about 2/3 of Americans say there are only two genders. 2/3 support, 2/3 oppose. The symmetry is striking and reveals something fascinating about where America stands on LGBTQ issues. Now, sexual orientation and gender identity are related issues. They're both central to LGBTQ rights. Advocates work on them together. Politicians bundle them in legislation. So, wouldn't we expect people's attitudes to align? If you support sexual minorities, might you also support gender minorities? But that's not what PRRI's data shows. This disconnect highlights what I call an asymmetry in public attitudes. Americans have largely come around to supporting legal equality for sexual minorities, but many have not extended that to diversity beyond the gender binary. And this pattern reveals something important about how social change actually works in America. It's not this smooth, linear progression where society just gets more progressive on everything at once. Instead, it's more like a series of waves, with different issues becoming contested and resolved at different moments. Let me tell you how I stumbled onto this. I spent years studying how Americans' attitudes evolve on contentious social issues, particularly around religion, gender, and sexuality. I've watched how evangelicals adapted to women entering the workforce, how attitudes towards same-sex relationships shifted over decades. But when I started analyzing PRRI's Gender and Politics survey data, something jumped out at me. Instead of just looking at people's attitudes about same-sex marriage or gender identity separately, we could map Americans based on both attitudes simultaneously. What emerged were 4 distinct groups, 4 different Americas, if you will, and the biggest group was surprising. The largest group, more than 1 in 3 Americans, supports same-sex marriage, but believes there are only 2 genders. The imbalance is striking. Americans who support sexual diversity but not gender diversity far outnumber the reverse. People are complex. Just because someone holds one view doesn't mean they automatically hold another, even on related issues. These aren't people who are uniformly traditional or uniformly progressive on LGBTQ issues. They've moved on one frontier, but not the other. There's the fully inclusive group, about 1 in 3 Americans who support both same-sex marriage and gender diversity. There's the fully traditional group, roughly 3 in 10, who oppose same-sex marriage and believe in only 2 genders. And then there's this tiny sliver, just about 2%, who oppose same-sex marriage, but affirm gender diversity. So small we can barely analyze them statistically. But that biggest group fascinates me. They represent this asymmetric moment in cultural change, when one social boundary has shifted and another turns to the next frontier. Now, who are these people? When you start mapping these groups using the data, clear patterns emerge, and they tell us something important about how different communities approach social change. Religion stands out as one of the clearest predictors, but not only in the way you might expect. Take white evangelical Protestants. Yes, most of them fall into that traditional category, opposing both. But here's what caught my attention. About 1 in 3 evangelicals actually support same-sex marriage, even while maintaining belief in only 2 genders. At the other end, Jewish Americans and the religiously unaffiliated are most likely to be inclusive on both issues, about half of each group. These tend to be what social scientists who study social change might call innovator groups, the first to embrace new social ideas. But here's the fascinating part. It's not just whether you're religious, it's how central religion is to your identity. Among Americans who say religion is the most important thing in their lives, that it's very, very important to them, roughly 2/3 oppose both sexual and gender diversity. But among those who say religion isn't important at all, about half are inclusive on both. The middle matters too. Americans with moderate religious importance are most likely to fall into that sexual diversity only category, supporting marriage equality, but drawing the line at gender fluidity. This mirrors a broader pattern in social change. Innovator groups tend to embrace both established and emerging issues, while groups that are slower to accept change often support only the issue that has reached broad social acceptance, in this case same-sex marriage, but resist the newer frontier of gender diversity. Why this pattern? I think exposure plays a role. Social scientists have long known that contact with minority groups tends to reduce prejudice over time. The numbers tell the story. More than 8 in 10 Americans say they know someone who is gay, lesbian, or bisexual, but only about 1 in 3 know someone who is transgender or uses gender-neutral pronouns, according to this survey data. That's a massive gap in familiarity, and it mirrors the timeline of visibility and advocacy. Many Americans lived through the gay rights movement. They watched friends, family members, colleagues come out. They saw same-sex couples fighting for marriage rights, raising children, dealing with all the ordinary challenges of life and love. The cultural narrative around same-sex marriage became something that many Americans could relate to. Commitment, family, love. These are values that resonate across religious and political divides. But gender minority visibility is much more recent in mainstream American culture. And the issues around gender identity, things like bathroom access, sports participation, medical care for young people, these feel different to many Americans, maybe a little more abstract or uncertain, or maybe just newer, and they haven't had time to process the issues yet. This reminds me of something I've observed in my research on social change over time. There's often a three-stage process when religious communities, and sometimes other groups or social divides, encounter social change: similarity, distinction, and adaptation. First, there's similarity. When nearly everyone in society agrees on an issue, various people, such as different religious groups, don't use it to distinguish themselves. If everyone is against something or everyone is for something, you can't distinguish yourself using that thing. Think about attitudes towards women working outside the home in the 1970s, or attitudes towards same-sex marriage through the early 1990s. Most Americans opposed those things, so they weren't particularly useful for drawing boundaries until these times when change started to occur. Then comes distinction. When an issue becomes contested in broader society, some religious groups often stake out the traditional position and use it to define themselves, providing a symbolic or cultural boundary against secular culture. We saw this with gender roles in the 1980s and 90s, and with same-sex marriage through the 2000s. Finally, there's adaptation. When the broader society shifts decisively, the tension of maintaining opposition may become too great. And religious groups and others who might be typically more traditional find ways to accommodate the change while distinguishing themselves on newly contested issues. What we are seeing here might be the evangelicals and other religious groups, conservatives, people that hold more traditional values, they're adapting on same-sex marriage while still drawing new lines around gender identity. The sexual diversity only pattern among religious Americans suggests this process in action. They support same-sex marriage rights, but still see a binary. Now, you can look and see how people talk about these issues. You can see this in the discourse and the ways people make sense of society. When PRRI asked Americans whether people spend too much time talking about gender and pronouns, about 3/4 of that sexual diversity group only agreed. That's much closer to the fully traditional group, the group that opposes both same-sex marriage and the idea of gender beyond the binary, than it is to the fully inclusive group. So in terms of talking about this discourse, these new ideas, this group is uncomfortable. It suggests a discomfort not just with gender minority identities, but with the very conversation around gender. Beyond limited support for gender diversity, the data reveal widespread discomfort with newer public forms of discourse around gender. Religious Americans who have made peace with same-sex marriage often talk about love, commitment, family values, concepts that fit within their existing frameworks. But gender identity challenges something more fundamental, the basic categories through which they understand human existence. For people whose worldview includes male and female as divinely created categories, accepting gender fluidity requires rethinking theology at a very deep level. It's not just about who you love, it's who you are. This connects to something I've observed in other research. In a study I did with a colleague on marijuana and same-sex marriage attitudes and how they change very similarly over time, we found that when issues tap into the same underlying values, in that case, individual autonomy and what government should regulate, they tend to change together. But even seemingly related issues can change at different rates if one gains more exposure or the issues are framed differently. This pattern fits within a larger story about how social change happens in America. It's rarely smooth or comprehensive. Instead, it's more like a series of social frontiers. First, one issue becomes contested and eventually resolved. Then attention shifts to the next. We saw this with women's rights, first voting, then working, then leadership roles. We saw it with racial equality, first the ending of slavery, then basic civil rights, then educational integration, and then some amount of economic opportunity. Each stage faced its own resistance and required its own strategies. Same-sex marriage has become broadly accepted because advocates successfully framed it in terms of existing American values: love, commitment, family, equality. The campaign was brilliant in its simplicity. Love is love. But gender identity doesn't fit as neatly into existing frameworks, or maybe the framing where it does fit just hasn't been found yet. It challenges not just laws or practices, but fundamental categories of understanding. That makes it both more difficult and, potentially, more transformative in how we think about the world. This sequence is not coincidental. When new cultural ideas become more visible through public discourse, personal contact, or institutional presence, they often provoke reflection, reaction, resistance. What was once unfamiliar becomes a site of cultural struggle and, in some cases, eventual normalization. Gender diversity now appears to be at that stage, increasingly visible, widely debated, and far from settled. Its emergence reflects a broader pattern of rising support for autonomy and especially self-expression that I've seen in other research. Americans increasingly affirm the right to define one's own identity and relationships across many issues, from women's equality to marijuana legalization to same-sex marriage. Gender expression beyond the binary may be the next wave in this frontier of individualization. Or, I guess I flipped that around a little bit, it may be the next frontier in this wave of individualization. What does this mean for advocates, policymakers, and ordinary Americans trying to understand our cultural moment? First, that sexual diversity only group, the people that only support same-sex marriage but still believe in the binary. This is more than 1 in 3 Americans, represents both an opportunity and a challenge. They've already moved on one LGBTQ issue, suggesting they're not immovably traditional. But they may need different arguments, different messengers, and even just more time to consider gender identity questions. Second, the role of contact and visibility matters enormously. As more Americans personally know gender minorities, attitudes will likely shift. But that's a gradual process, and policy battles are happening now. Third, we might be witnessing a snapshot in time, a transition moment. Just as evangelical attitudes on gender roles eventually adapted to women's workforce participation, and just as many religious Americans found ways to support same-sex marriage rights, we might see similar adaptation on gender identity over time. But the timeline matters. Each wave of social change has its own rhythm, its own resistance, its own resolution. What strikes me particularly as a researcher is how this data reveals Americans actively thinking through complex issues rather than simply defaulting to kind of these comprehensive all-or-nothing ideological positions where they take all of the progressive stances or all of the traditional stances. The person who supports same-sex marriage but believes in two genders isn't necessarily inconsistent. They're making distinctions that make sense to them within their worldview, their experience, their exposure. This creates opportunities and challenges. It means minds can be changed, but also means different issues require different approaches. The arguments that worked for marriage equality may or may not be as effective for gender or minority rights. It also reminds us that behind these statistics are real people navigating real consequences. While Americans debate gender identity and polling data, gender minorities themselves face very concrete challenges around healthcare, education, and basic participation in community life. The research shows us something about the nature of social change itself. It's messy, uneven, and often creates temporary coalitions that don't make perfect sense from an advocacy standpoint, but do reflect how real people actually process complex social questions. So, where might this all lead? Whether views on gender minorities will evolve the same way they have on sexual minorities remains uncertain, but history offers some clues. Growing exposure will likely drive attitude change over time, but the timeline for gender minority acceptance may be different from that for sexual minorities. Growing exposure to gender diversity may help pave the way for greater acceptance. While about 8 in 10 Americans say they know someone who is gay, lesbian, or bisexual, currently, only about 1 in 3 know someone who is transgender or uses gender-neutral pronouns. But that exposure is rising over time, mirroring the pattern once seen with sexual orientation. The strategies that prove successful for marriage equality, emphasizing love, family, commitment, may need adaptation here. Religious communities may eventually find ways to accommodate gender diversity, just as many found ways to support same-sex marriage. but that adaptation process is still in its early stages. And policy change may sometimes lead public opinion rather than follow it, creating new realities that Americans then adjust to over time. The large group of Americans who accept sexual diversity while rejecting gender diversity represents a familiar moment in cultural change, when one social boundary has shifted and attention turns to the next frontier. Their ambivalence may be less a final position than a snapshot, a moment of a society in transition. What this research really shows me is that Americans are more thoughtful and complex in their attitudes than some might assume. They're not just reflexively progressive or traditional. They're making distinctions based on their understanding of the world. As someone who studies social change, I find that both encouraging and challenging. Encouraging because it suggests minds can be changed through engagement and exposure. Challenging because it means sustainable change requires understanding how people actually think, not just how we wish they would think. The great divide on LGBTQ issues isn't just between supporters and opponents. It's between different ways of understanding identity, community, and change itself. And bridging that divide requires recognizing the complexity of where Americans actually are, not just where we think they should be, the ways that we see them. They are real people with real experiences, with real perspectives, and sometimes they do change their minds. I'm Landon Schnabel, and thanks for thinking through this research with me.
So while we covered a lot over the course of this podcast, we hope you learned a thing or two about the current state of attitudes toward LGBTQ rights in the US and what questions remain unanswered.
And we also hope that the research shared today could act as a propellant for future advances in LGBTQ research.
And we are excited to clarify the complex nature of attitudes towards LGBTQ rights in America today. Thanks for listening.